Greetings to you wherever you might be. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and I welcome you to today's webinar, Will America's Venezuela Campaign Impact Russia's War on Ukraine? What, if any, will be the impact on America's removal of Maduro from Venezuela have on Ukraine and Russia's now 11-year-old war against Ukraine and the West? To discuss this question today, we have members of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network, FOUN, Ambassador John Herbst. John had a long and distinguished career in the Department of State, including his serving as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006. He now serves as the head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and is chair of FOUN's National Security Task Force. Ambassador Dan Fried. Dan had a distinguished 40-year foreign service career, including serving as U.S. ambassador to Poland, and had critical assignments at the National Security Council. Dan is now a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. General Phil Breedlove's long and distinguished career in the United States Air Force included far too many important commands both in the U.S. and abroad to list. But as a four-star general, he was the 17th Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Ed Chow is an international energy expert with over 45 years of industry experience. He has worked in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, South America, Europe, Russia, Caspian, and Black Sea regions. Ed spent 20 years with Chevron Corporation in the U.S. and overseas, including as head of the International External Affairs and Country Manager in China. And Ed is sought out for advice by governments from around the world, including our own. 5 days ago, Venezuela's government aligned with Russia while many of its citizens supported Ukraine. Maduro was a Putin ally. Then 4 days ago, he was gone, and it would seem all the ramifications and potential ramifications are yet to be completely understood. Phil, I suspect as a military man with extraordinary international experience, there are many questions that arise from the administration's actions in Venezuela. What are your thoughts, including the relevance of Venezuela being an ally to Russia and the apparent Washington possibility of adopting the sphere of influence philosophy we hear so often from the Kremlin?
Well, first of all, again, it's awesome to be on a panel like this with great friends and people I both admire and respect, and I'll be doing a lot more listening than talking today. I think there's two or three things to hit. I'm going to hit the easy one first because I think Ed Chow's going to really cover that. And that is that Venezuela has a lot of mineral and petrochemical assets that are important to the rest of the world, important to America and important to others. And Russia and China have been enjoying a rather exclusive relationship as it plays out in certainly the oil and petrochemical industry, but the rare earths and minerals also. And so I think it's important, and Ed will explain this, I'm sure, much further, that now China and Russia cannot take for granted what they may have been able to take for granted before this action. Second thing I'd like to say is a very tactical thing, but I think it's important. And that is, for some years, China has been learning from, buying from, and growing their air defense capabilities and industries based on Russian kit. And what we have seen now, not only in the actions of eastern Syria and in the actions of Iran, and now certainly in the actions in Venezuela, is that American stealth and air power can run amok inside of these defense systems. And so if I was China, who's primary backbone to their air defense network is basically the 300 version of Russia's air defense capabilities. I would have a few big concerns right now about my ability to be able to deal with Western stealth, Western electronic warfare, and Western jamming. And then I think the final thing to say is that, in America, we've taken a bit of a black eye across the last several months as Mr. Putin continually rebuffs American efforts at peace, and not only rebuffs our efforts at peace, but thereafter attacks Ukraine typically in a ferocious manner right after they rebuff the American offers. And so American capabilities and power in the sort of peace through strength mantra has come under challenge because of Mr. Putin's basically ability to put us in our box. I think this is one more message back to that part of the world, to the BRICS, to the Russias and Chinas and Irans of the world, that American military power, when it is actually used, is very capable. In Afghanistan, we were able to establish essentially air supremacy. In Iran, we established air superiority, if not air supremacy. And now we have gone into the jaws of Russian and Chinese equipment in Venezuela and quickly dispatched it. I think it's a message that when America has the resolve to use its military power, it is something to behold. And hopefully that will give Mr. Putin some pause. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you, Phil. Dan, reactions in Kiev seems to have been mixed. You probably know more about them than I do, but a Russian ally is down. That's a good thing. But will this mean, as some suggest, Russia goes along with our taking Venezuela and we walk away from Ukraine, or we turn all our attention into our hemisphere? What are your thoughts?
That fear is precisely what bothers me. No one is going to miss Maduro. I don't think we should mourn his passing. But the administration's arguments for the operation in Venezuela suggest a Fortress America mentality and Stephen Miller's comments yesterday to CNN suggest might makes right, deals between great powers at the expense of others, and a kind of gleeful abandonment of the principles that America has championed for 80 years and longer. So I think the Ukrainians are right to be concerned about that. If I were the Ukrainians also, I would be concerned about American intentions vis-a-vis Greenland, because that has the potential of destroying the NATO alliance. And all of this is taking place at a time when there is progress being made on security arrangements for Ukraine. It's been overshadowed by at least in this country, by the developments in Venezuela. But look, national security advisors from the Coalition of the Willing met in Kyiv. Now the Coalition of the Willing leaders are meeting in Paris. The U.S. is going to be represented. I haven't seen the drafts, but this looks serious. I think too many Americans dismissed it because they didn't think that Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner could negotiate something. But they're not the only negotiators. You have General Grinkevich involved. So all of this, these arrangements are taking shape in a way that actually might work. But if the U.S. is distracted by Fortress America, or it really intends to push some aggression against Greenland, weakening NATO, that undermines the good work that's being undertaken right now. I'm one of the people who thinks that the Trump plan or the Trump approach to pushing forward with a political arrangement to end the war in Ukraine could work. I'm not cynical about that. But the more destructive elements of Trump's policies could undermine this more hopeful stream of work. Now, Venezuela could still end decently. We could get to the other side of this with a stable democratic government, and then it might be in 30 years as forgotten as the invasion of Panama was forgotten. I'll bet very few people listening were thinking about the invasion of Panama in 1989 a week ago. And the reason people weren't thinking about it is because it was successful. It is possible the action against Maduro will be successful, but the signs are not great because we are not working as the Bush administration did to empower the Democratic opposition and to create a new government. We seem to be relying on the Maduro people. That seems to me a questionable bet. So if I'm Ukraine, I worry about a lot of this, especially at a time where I sense that progress is being made.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. John, our audience, if they've been with us before, I usually have John do the wrap up. But I'll turn to Ed in a minute to look at the oil implications. But first, John, I'll ask you to react to your fellow FOUN members who have spoken on behalf of the National Security Task Force. Your thoughts, summaries, comments?
Okay. First, I don't have any doubt that our strike, our surgical snatch of Maduro, was not just a demonstration globally that we can act with decisiveness and effectively, but also a clear reminder that Russia cannot. The war correspondents, the Voyenkuri in Russia, are going nuts after the operation. On the one hand, they say, well, this is the United States acting like a global aggressor, ignoring all the rules and doing whatever it pleases. And that is an argument that does resonate in Latin America. So it's not something we can simply dismiss. On the other hand, they're bowled over by the efficiency and the success of the operation. And you even have some saying, maybe what we need to do is to hire American generals, which is a wise guy way of saying our generals aren't doing so well in Ukraine, which of course they're not. But besides the efficiency of the operation, there's also the fact that we have struck at an ally of the Kremlin, and Putin can do nothing or almost nothing. And of course, this is not the first time that's happened. It happened when we struck at Iran and delivered a massive blow to its nuclear program in June. And Maduro asked for Putin's help in October. According to the Washington Post, he got bupkis, he got nothing, except for rhetoric. The same was true with the mullahs and Putin before we struck and after we struck in June. And so Moscow looks like an observer as opposed to a global power. And that's because it is an observer. And there are two reasons for this. One is Moscow simply lacks our capacity. They are our nuclear power peer, the only one. But we see that they don't have much geopolitical reach. They had some with Wagner in Africa, but Wagner was partly destroyed by their being thrown into the maw of the Ukraine war. and partly by Putin's reaction to Prigozhin's march on Moscow. Even Prigozhin turned around before he got there. And Prigozhin now rests with the fishes, as any Godfather fan understands. Well, so Moscow's ability to project power is a trifle compared to ours. And they don't have the resources for even what they were able to do. For example, when they bombed opposition forces in Syria in 2015 and saved the Assad regime. And of course, even before Trump returned to the Oval Office, they lost Assad because they didn't have the resources to stop the Islamic rebels from proceeding. But that's only half of the equation when we talk about Putin's basically just watching what happened and saying something here or there, but nothing which would annoy Trump. And that is, he is very concerned about annoying Trump. Putin's adventure in Ukraine is not going very well. And he knows he'll be in far worse trouble if Trump were to exercise peace through strength vis-a-vis the Kremlin, the way he exercised it vis-a-vis Maduro or the mullahs in Iran. Trump said numerous times he wants a durable peace in Ukraine, and he would make the recalcitrant party, as he seeks peace, pay a price. But he has been reluctant to put serious pressure on the Kremlin. He did put sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, and he deserves credit for that. And that was in the middle of October or late October. And Putin was deeply concerned by that. And he dispatched Kirill Dmitriev to meet with Witkoff, which led to the infamous 28 points, which were delivered to Zelensky. Too many Russian points in the American 28 points, which were delivered to Zelensky in the middle of November. And Putin saw, much to his consternation, that the initiative that began with Dmitriev and Witkoff turned into Trump and Zelensky in Mar-a-Lago just 3 weeks ago, not even 3 weeks ago, and reaching a basic agreement on points that could end the war. And Putin does not want to say no to those points because they include things like security guarantees. So the point that I'm making is that Putin was going to waste no capital on Maduro because he does not want to get on Trump's bad side. And that's how Russia got to where it is, between its resource problems and its Ukraine problem. Now, how does the war affect our policy towards the war? Excuse me, how does the operation in Caracas affect our policy towards Putin's aggression in Ukraine? And more broadly, the war itself. I think that there is a danger that we could wind up over our heads in Venezuela. And I agree with Dan's assessment that we don't seem to be working in a helpful way with the democratic opposition in the country. And we need to have people with legitimacy and authority. And I don't mean authority in terms of guns and brass knuckles, but authority in terms of people respecting their point of view. We have to have them working with us to restore stability to the country. So when I saw them basically distancing themselves from Machado, I thought that was a mistake. But then we've seen some stories come out over the past 24 hours that they actually reached out to her and thought she did not have the chops to actually make a difference. I'm not a Venezuela expert. I can't make the judgment if that's a sensible analysis or not. But we're also seeing things about them working with people currently in power who obviously were working for Maduro, who might be able to manage a transition to a new Venezuela. But anyway, if that works, that would be a great victory for us and for the whole region, even globally. But we don't know if it'll work. And if it doesn't work, we could get bogged down in Venezuela in ways that would take our eye off what's happening in Europe and Ukraine. And that would be a true fiasco because American interests in Venezuela are real. But despite what people who don't understand geopolitics say, they don't compare to our interest in making sure Putin does not destabilize Europe, which a Kremlin victory in Ukraine would most definitely do. All right, I think I've probably said enough for now. Thank you.
John, thank you, Maduro. Ed, it seems like the further away we get from the actual invasion and extraction in Venezuela, the more we hear about Venezuela's oil, that President Trump wants it, that if the U.S. can control it, there will be bad consequences for Russia's economy and its war machine. This certainly is not my world. I'm interested in hearing what your perspective is. Ed?
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you for the overly generous introduction. But I have to tell the audience that no one in our government consulted me before this operation in Venezuela, which means, I suppose, that I can speak freely. I'm going to make 3 points that hopefully they will become shorter as they go. The first thing I would say is that policy should be based on realistic expectations of the desired outcome. And here I worry because there's so much bad information out there, even in major media. You start with the idea that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world at 300 billion barrels, they claim. In 1998, when Hugo Chavez was first elected president of Venezuela, Venezuelan oil reserves were listed at below 80 billion barrels. And Venezuela was producing about 3.5 million barrels per day at the time. Today, Venezuela is producing less than 1 million barrels per day. So clearly, the Chavez and Maduro have repeatedly revised the reserve numbers upwards while production keeps going down. So for anyone to believe the 300 billion barrels, you have to believe that the Chavistas are either the greatest explorationists in the world or the lousiest producers of oil in the world, or both. And that figure is simply not believable. And I just don't think that we should base policies on factual errors, if not lies to ourselves. Now, 80 billion barrels a day 80 billion barrels of reserves is a big number. So there's no doubt Venezuela has a lot of oil. That 80 billion barrels, for example, is larger than the proven reserves in the United States. So Venezuela has a lot of oil, but you have to be able to get that oil out. And that's where the challenge is. So it just worries me when we start, setting unrealistic expectations. I read that President Trump yesterday said that it would take less than 18 months to restore Venezuelan oil infrastructure. Well, most industry people would say that it would take 5 to 10 years, if not longer, and tens of billions and not over $100 billion to be invested before we see a significant increase in Venezuelan oil production. This whole atmosphere here in Washington reminds me of in 1993 when then Deputy Secretary of Defense Frank Wolfowitz said that oil will pay for Iraqi reconstruction. Well, what happened there was that it took more than 5 years after American occupation of Iraq that major oil deals were signed between Iraq and major oil companies. And most of those companies, it turned out, were Russian and Chinese companies and some European companies, but not American companies whose risk tolerance are somewhat different. So, the idea that we can quickly increase Venezuela production is just a fantasy in my mind. The reason it relates to Ukraine, in my mind, is, and frankly, I've been worried about this since the Trump administration and Ukraine started negotiating or discussing the so-called minerals deal, is again regarding how much can be delivered within a reasonable period of time. Natural resource development takes a long time. Mining investments take even longer than oil and gas investments to be realized and start making a return. You have to do evaluation of the geology, you have to look at the investment conditions. And if all the conditions are right, normally it takes 1 to 2 years for companies to negotiate with host governments on a long-term contract. And this is assuming that all conditions are favorable. The reason it takes a long time is because you want to make sure that long-term deals stand the test of time, that it works in the long run for both the host government as well as the investors. The last thing I would say is that if control of natural resources is the primary motivation for foreign policy and not overall national security interests, then Russia has a lot more natural resources and fanciful investment opportunities to offer than Ukraine or just about anyone else. And apparently, this is what happened when President Putin met with President Trump in Anchorage. Is Russia offering, say, if resources is what you want, then no, we got a lot more that you can be looking at. Now, those projects won't happen either, but that's not the point. The point is that control of natural resources, in my mind, should not be the primary driver of foreign policy.
Wow, that was interesting. And it certainly, as I think you said, is not what we're reading in most papers and other news outlets. It's and that's not the first time we've had misinformation that we're worrying about. And I guess part of the question, was whether all this would have any impact on whether the oil would have any impact on the Russian war machine and so forth. And it sounds like it if it ever would, it might be years down the line.
Yeah, not anytime soon. There are other things, including the price of oil, how strongly Western sanctions are enforced, that would affect it much more than anything that's happening in Venezuela.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, we have a question from one of our FOUN members who couldn't be on this because he's traveling today. So this may be from an airport or a train or something. General Hodges says, what's the legal basis is the administration using for its operations in Venezuela? And what would be the legal basis for any operations in Greenland? Anybody want to take that?
Let me jump in and try. The legal justification that the administration has used for Venezuela is is thin, verging on laughable. That is, it wasn't a military operation at all. It was merely an arrest of a person who was wanted. That's thin. They don't take that, they themselves don't even take that seriously. With respect to Greenland, judging by Stephen Miller's rather intemperate interview on CNN, I would say they haven't even bothered to come up with something, at least not yet. But we were similarly on shaky legal ground in 1989 when we invaded Panama, and yet that was largely forgiven and forgotten because there was a successful transition to a stable democratic government, which is a way of saying that the only way to justify a legally questionable act is when it succeeds. Now, that's not a pure statement. That's not a statement of a purist. I get that. And I understand the problems. But the George H.W. Bush administration got away with it because it succeeded. And because nobody missed Noriega. Because he really was a bad actor. Maduro doesn't have democratic legitimacy. So the administration could, in the end, achieve vindication if it backs a democratic government. The trouble is, we seem to be backing the remnants of the Maduro regime, counting on them to keep order and dealing with them on oil. Well, that puts us against the opposition and apparently the majority of the Venezuelan people. That puts us on the side of the bad guys. What did we call them? Narco-terrorists? That strikes me as an unsustainable place. And with respect to Greenland, and Ben Hodges's comment, when Stephen Miller is suggesting that Denmark doesn't have a claim to Greenland, he's ignoring his own country, the United States' own legal position. We formally recognized Denmark's right to Greenland back in 1917.
Yeah.
So we don't have much of a case. And in the case of Greenland, we don't even have the opportunity to retroactively vindicate a legally questionable action because Denmark is a democracy. The Greenland government does not seem to be interested in becoming part of the United States. So it's ugly. And Putin loves this because it vindicates him and his worldview, is that rules are for suckers and only power counts, which is exactly what Stephen Miller said to CNN. That only strength and power count. And that's supposedly realistic. That's nuts. Stephen Miller needs to go back and study history. We discovered on December 7th, 1941, that neither Fortress America nor isolationism would keep us safe. It is more realistic to build structures against what Roosevelt called gangsterism in the world than it is to try to achieve security by becoming a gangster. And Ukraine's theory of its own defense is that it is fighting for survival and for a rules-based order, and they are correct. This is right. And they are appealing to the American strategy that we put into effect after 1945 that Trump sometimes seems to be running away from, though thank God not all the time. Anyway, I sense behind Ben Hodges' question a lot of concern, which I share. Oh, and by the way, Ed Chow's point, if I could extrapolate from that, and I agree with him, Ed Chow is pointing out that that resources are not like a pot of gold in the ground that you dig up quickly and run away with. Okay, that's his point, that the exploitation of natural resources takes time, capital, political stability, and a sustainable governance system, which is exactly what we should be trying to do in Venezuela instead of oddly staying offshore and relying on the remnants of the Maduro regime to keep order. What? That puts us on whose side and against whom? Anyway, that's just my extrapolation from Ed Chow's absolutely, seemingly spot on point about resources. Sorry to go on, but it's been a heck of a couple of days.
This is sort of off point, but going back to both what Phil and John said about our military operation and the impressiveness of it in Venezuela, and then the subject of Panama comes up. I have one little story coming from that, personal. When we went into Panama, we had a significant amount of time trying to find Noriega. And too long a story, but a colonel in the Pentagon, when I was trying to get information that was relevant to when we would be able to get the canal open, the colonel tied me into a call with a colonel we had on the ground in Panama. And he said, "When are we going to get Noriega?" And the colonel on the ground says, "I don't know, but we have his picture on every milk carton down here." We've advanced since then. Ed, do you have any comment after what Dan added to your comments?
Sure. I mean, in a slightly different vein. I completely agree with General Breedlove and Ambassador Herbst that the prowess of American military power makes a big impression around the world. As it happens, I was living in Beijing as Chevron country manager when we liberated Kuwait. And it definitely had an impact. So the point is that there's no question of America's ability to exercise military power. Is our staying power that is in question here once this operation is over. This is not mission impossible. This is not we extracted or we knocked off the bad guy and then everything is fine. We have to be able to follow through. And here, I think that's Dan's point, that the inconsistency in our approach on this, we are able to adopt a head of state because we consider him to be illegally in place because of a flawed election. But at the same time, we're dealing with the vice president who was elected by the same election. So, how long we're going to be able to stay working this one through, as we did in Panama, as opposed to then moving on to the next target, whether that's Cuba, Greenland, Mexico, you take your pick. I think that's the point where the rest of the world is observing, as well as being impressed by our military prowess.
Thanks, Ed. John has to leave us in about 6 minutes. And so I've got a couple of questions for others. But John, you've heard a lot. Let you comment here before you have to leave us.
Okay. I think that we're all focusing on what's the most important question when we're talking about the Venezuela operation, which is, will a stable environment be relatively easy to establish? And the shorter answer is we don't know. But I see Phil shaking his head vigorously. No, it's not going to happen. I think the odds are in favor of your view, Phil, but I don't think they're 100% or even 90%. And we'll wait and see. It's absolutely clear, though, that we don't need additional adventures as long as things in Venezuela are questionable or unstable. And it's possible that they're trying, the administration, on the basis of the success of the snatch, trying to intimidate unfriendly governments to do things we want. And if that's the game, okay. But if it's not, then we are biting off serious problems. As it is, we may have bitten off a serious problem. We don't know yet. But the idea is to make sure we settle that before we take on anything else. And I'll just make Dan, I think, covered Greenland very well. I would just add one point, which is important beyond the many excellent points Dan made. The ostensible reason for this consideration is that we need Greenland for American security. And I don't disagree that we need be able to have access to Greenland. We need to be able to put forces in Greenland to deal with our adversaries who are active in the Arctic. But the point is, the Danes are welcoming of just about anything we want to do. And we have the ability to do more than we're doing right now without having to take a hostile act against a longtime ally who's been a very faithful ally. And there's also another point related to this, which is I wish, and I think American interest would be strengthened if the administration spoke of our adversaries, China and Russia, as they look at Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the way they speak about it when they talk about Greenland. Because if Russia is truly our adversary, and it is, then Putin's vulnerability is where he has overextended himself. And all we need to do is provide Ukraine the economic and military means to make Putin pay for that vulnerability. And then Trump could achieve the durable peace that he would like to see, or at least he says he would like to see. And I think on that note, Robert, I'm done. But thank you for the opportunity to participate. It's always a pleasure, especially with this wonderful group of very smart and amiable folks.
Thank you, John.
And I'll return to Kira. Bye.
Ed, one quick question. I mean, I think I know the answer, but at one point, weren't U.S. oil investments, primarily oil investments, nationalized in Venezuela?
It's a long and complicated story, and I know General Breedlove wants to jump in on a couple pertinent points. But this is a process that happened actually in the 1970s, way before Hugo Chavez and Maduro. And it was supported, the nationalization was supported by center-right and center-left democratically elected governments of Venezuela. And it wasn't just all American companies. Shell was a big player in Venezuela, for example. What the Chavez and Maduro did, what they did was not nationalization as such, as they reneged on the licenses that they granted American companies such as ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. So, oil companies never getting title to the oil. They get a license to operate, to extract the oil and make money from it. But, the idea that we own oil in another sovereign country territory is just maybe Washington shorthand, but it bypasses a lot of facts and history.
Thank you. Phil?
First of all, I'm glad you skipped over it, because every time Ed says something, I learn something, and I appreciate his last remarks. Second of all, I want to violently agree with everything John said when he was aboard. I would like to add a couple of small concerns or modifications. And before I make a bunch of people mad, where I stand, two things are absolutely true. One, a bad guy was removed from an illegitimate position. Two, the U.S. military and the intelligence community did a magnificent job. Okay, a magnificent job. But as this all played out, one of the things that worries me is I'm thinking back to Libya. We had a massive, great military plan. And then we had bupkis beyond that. If you grossly simplify national power to diplomatic power, informational power, military power, and economic power, it seems like in Libya and now in Venezuela, we have a military plan and we have no plan for beyond that. I watched the faces of a couple of our senior most leaders the first time that our president said that we were going to run the company. And it was clear that they were surprised. So I do believe that, we have entered into this position without concrete plans for the rest of what happens next. And if you look at where Libya is today, we do not want Venezuela to be there in 10 years. Okay, so we need to do some scrambling now and put together all of the rest of a government or rest of nation plan as it relates to Venezuela. And then I'll be incredibly blunt here. It should not surprise you that a former military commander of NATO would have this opinion. But the idea, even the discussion, allowing a discussion of an idea that we might use force to take Greenland from a NATO ally, it's ludicrous. It's beyond the insane. It really speaks to a lack of understanding of what alliances and our relationships around the world mean. And we need to get off of this point, in my opinion. Thank you.
Can you speak clearly, please? What should Ukraine be doing now? I mean, has all of this, is there an influence here on what Ukraine should be doing and saying that would be different than it was 3 days, 4 days ago? Dan, any thoughts?
I don't think Ukraine would be well advised to get into this at all. Certainly not about Venezuela. If they want to applaud the downfall of an illegitimate, corrupt, and repressive ruler who was pro-Russian, fine. They have every reason to do so. I think that they should also stay out of the Greenland issue. The Ukrainians have handled the Trump administration well. They have made good progress. Steve Witkoff has now issued a brief positive statement about the discussions among the coalition of the willing in Paris. So there's progress being made. That's where the Ukrainians ought to be. There's not much they can do, and they shouldn't be. They've learned how to avoid incurring the wrath of Trump in ways that don't help them. And they can count on their friends in Europe and the United States doing whatever we can to avoid the worst scenarios in Venezuela and stop an absolutely revolting and indefensible action against Greenland. And I'm thoroughly with Phil Breedlove on this. That's just shameful, but it's not the Ukrainian. It may be the Ukrainians' problem, but it's not their problem to try to solve.
I agree. I agree. Before the extraction and the rest of the actions that are ongoing, how much support, I mean, tangible support, was Venezuela giving to Russia? I mean, can we state that? I mean, whether it was oil or anything other than Maduro being an ally? Was there anything more than that, Phil?
It's really not an area where I have a lot of knowledge. What I do know, and I think again Ed Chow would be better suited to talk to us. I do know that both China and Russia were were benefiting greatly from their enterprise in petrochemicals, and frankly, one thing that I really believe the administration has right is they were beginning to make, and I'll use a military term, they were beginning to make a beachhead in our backyard that we do not want to put up with as far as a strategic position for those countries to exert their influence from. So I think that there's some intangibles, and I would defer now to Ed to be more clear on this.
Ed?
Uh, well, I'm pretty sure that Rosneft has been active in Venezuela on the upstream side and perhaps downstream as well. China has actually, over the years, reduced their oil investments in Venezuela because it's such a dysfunctional government and economy to try to operate in. It is true that China is the major buyer of Venezuelan oil, though, and they do this because Venezuelan oil, once it was sanctioned by the United States, became very cheap. And so they were taking commercial trading advantage of Venezuelan oil being cheap. I mean, the world has changed so much, and maybe Dan will remember this, that during the first Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually talked to Lavrov about how to solve the problem in Venezuela. And so we've now gone to active measures, as the Soviets might say, on resolving the situation in Venezuela. I don't know how much influence the Russians would have on Venezuela now. I think the place to watch is probably Cuba, which rely heavily on Venezuela for fuel oil to keep the lights on in Havana. And so what happens, what do the Russians do there would be interesting to watch. Would the Russians start supplying fuel oil to Cuba again, as they did before Hugo Chavez stepped in? Or no, would they stay away because the tankers they chartered would be vulnerable to American interdiction? So I think that's where I would watch what Russia's going to do. China, of course, condemned what we did on Saturday morning. But if you watch Chinese social media, which honestly, you cannot get the volume of Chinese social media on the same storyline if the government wasn't permitting it, suggests that what we did might be a template for Taiwan. So that's awfully alarming, I think.
Thanks, Ed. Well, we're closing in on the last few minutes of our hour. Why don't we do a lightning round, if you want to call it that, and I'll go back in the order that we started off with. Phil, I know you were reacting when Ed said something about Cuba, but your closing comments.
Well, I think that we have once again, I'll just say a good thing has happened in that a bad guy who was an illegitimate leader quote unquote leader of a country has been removed. And what we now need to do is snatch victory from the jaws of victory rather than have, as we have occasionally, snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. And so we need the next steps of the plan to how do we bring Venezuela back into a relationship with the West that is a little more straightforward and benefits us all.
Thank you. Dan?
Agree with what Phil said. Secondly, there is a debate within the Trump administration about whether we're all about Fortress America or whether we want to see Russia defeated in Ukraine, or at least Ukraine survive as an independent country. So Ukraine needs to be mindful of that. But right now, they're doing the right thing by working with us on the security framework and the other elements of a plan. And it still pays to count on Vladimir Putin's arrogance to alienate President Trump.
Thank you. Thank you. Ed?
Well, I think I certainly agree with General Breedlove that we need to be thinking about the day after now. And I wish we had thought about the day after the day before rather than after the fact. But this is where we are now. And that requires a lot of hard work and staying power. And the world will be watching what is this administration's attention span. We got to get this right. It's too close to us. It's too important to have a failed state in Venezuela. And we really need to focus on this, and we don't need any additional distractions. And on the Russia front, completely agree with Ambassador Herbst that we're concerned about security in Europe. The most important thing to do is to support Ukraine economically and in terms of military assistance and weapons as well.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for our audience. With that, I'll say good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for attending.